Hi there.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi, gang. How is everyone?
Yeah.
Doing well. Kyle, I don't think I've met you virtually before.
No, but I've been following the channel here and there. But yeah, first time this has caught my attention enough to yeah, definitely join the meeting since we're talking about front end feature flagging. Nice to meet you all.
Hey, Kyle. Nice to meet you.
Hey.
All right. Hey, Thomas.
Hey.
All right. Morning, Pete. Are you still good to be the scribe? Sorry.
Could I volunteer
Bad
to be
timing.
the scribe?
What's up?
Could I volunteer to be the scribe? I guess if I volunteer to be the scribe, then I'm good to be the scribe.
Okay.
I totally didn't remember doing that, but yeah, I can do that.
Well, it's
All
been
right,
a month since our last meeting, so it can't really be faulted for losing track.
If you don't feel up for it, I'm sure we can find another volunteer, but you're on the list at the moment.
I'm up for it. I'm ready. I trade for this.
Up for the challenge. Perfect. All right. Well, hey, Jake. Morning,
Hello.
Justin. All right. I'll share out the link real quick. Perfect. All right. Looks like we got a pretty good turnout, so we can go ahead and get started. If you don't mind just adding yourself to the participants list. And then if you have any agenda items, feel free to add them. You can probably go ahead and get started. And thanks, Pete, for volunteering to be the scribe and remembering. Do we have any volunteers for next one? That one may be subject to cancel it to being canceled, because it's pretty close to the holidays, but as of now it's scheduled. So if there's
When does it
that-
land?
22nd.
22nd.
So
I'll take that one. I mean, yeah, we might cancel it, but I'll take it in the next one if.
oh, thanks, Todd. All right. And then for newcomers, it looks like Kyle. Would you mind doing a quick introduction? I've seen you on Slack and stuff, but I don't think you've been at a community meeting before.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so my name's Kyle. I helped found Flagsmith with Ben. I don't know how many years ago now, but I've been doing front-end development for the past 10 years. So my focus, and I've been building a lot of apps, web apps, mobile apps in feature flag software. So yeah, I just wanted to join and see what's going on in the sort of front end landscape with the OpenFeature.
Perfect. Yeah, welcome. All right, and I think everyone else has had their chance to introduce themselves, right? If not, feel free to speak up. But I think Jake, you did it last time, if I remember right, looking through the list. Perfect. All right. Cool. It looks like, yeah, Kyle, your topic's up first then.
Brilliant. Okay. I think, well, actually, before I share my screen and go through sort of an example, looking at the spec of OpenFeature at the moment, it seems like it has been primarily focused around sort of like back-end development and back-end integrations to feature flags. So I've got experience in creating like node clients with feature flags, and I'd say the current spec is like really well suited to sort of like back-end development. But in front-end development, seeing not just Flagsmith, but the way the other front-end clients work, I would say it's quite fundamentally different to the way people interact with feature flags from a back-end integration perspective. And I guess my first sort of question was around whether there was a consideration to try and have the spec be the same for front-end client, or for clients versus server, or whether we're trying to sort of combine both of them into one. That's the sort of like main topic. I don't know whether I should continue or we should start having a discussion about that.
One is better than two if we can manage it. And if we can't manage it, it's better to have two than have one really crappy one.
Yeah.
I think we have talked about it. It's come up a few times in the past, and I think there's my take on like, or my kind of interpretation of the past discussions is kind of like basically, I guess what just Justin said is like that there's definitely like you said, just like totally agree with you, Carl. Like most of the existing vendors, or most of the kind of like vendors that are out there tend to have a different like SDK and a different API for the front end and the back end. But it would be awesome if we could, one of the whole kind of goals with OpenFeature is to kind of like avoid kind of repeating and kind of rebuilding stuff for each kind of platform, etc. So it would be amazing if we could have a common SDK, or sorry, common spec, and like ideally even a common like actual SDK implementation for the case of JavaScript, and I guess like Kotlin, like things that are shared across like front end and back end, and then build like kind of like platform specific things on top of that shared SDK and that shared API that kind of like give more ergonomics. And I actually think that's like going to be a real challenge to do, because of some of the stuff that you mentioned in the Slack conversation, and that like getting it to be both like achieving that balance of it being like easy to use for like a front end dev and a back end dev, and easy to and like a shared implementation. I think it would be super hard to do, but and I think partly because of that we've kind of punted on focusing on the front end stuff. That's that's like my kind of summary of the current state of things. But I think there's definitely not an expectation. Like there's not I don't think we're sitting like where we are today saying like, oh, well, I mean, I'm pretty sure that the way it is going to work fine for front end folks. And like, what's the big deal?
Yeah. My thinking is that without having seen this thread that you're talking about, and so willing to be wrong here, is that we can probably come up with an SDK that is consistent across client device usage and servers, but the providers are going to be very different. Like an individual vendor is going to have different providers because there's different caching needs and a bunch of other stuff like that. And so I think that's where I would personally like to head.
Yeah, I agree. I also think, without being too pedantic, it's worth noting that, Kyle, what you said was a common spec. I think we definitely want a common spec. There may be a section of the spec that specifically addresses clients. Yeah. Common SDKs is, I think, what we've spent a lot of time talking about. A common SDK between client and backend is I think what we've been talking about. And I agree with Justin, and I think it's a good thing to shoot for, and I think it's possible. I also agree with Pete that I don't think we've arrived at that yet, and so that's kind of the next stage. I think we should shoot for a common SDK. We just don't have it yet. I do think it's possible, and we should attempt it.
Just thinking as well, like, sorry, it's a bit confusing because we're in the same room.
No, both are muted.
There we go. I haven't muted.
I think one of the things that is important, I think there's different things that need to be prioritized here. And so one of the things that we should try and prioritize, in my opinion, is the behavior of OpenFeature when changing providers, like doesn't change in a completely ridiculous way. Like, I think there could be a tendency to just go, well, we'll just let the provider figure that out. And if that's like completely different, then that's not OpenFeature's responsibility. Like, where that line is drawn, I think is kind of difficult to know. And I think it would be a shame if it was like, you know, because kind of the one of the goals is to, one of the main goals has been to prevent vendor lock-in. If you were to just make it so that the behavior was radically different amongst providers. Now, there's definitely not there's definitely not a solution, right? Like, that's not possible that works in a perfect, you know, you're not going to be able to just change one line of code and, you know, all of a sudden everything's on a different platform and working in exactly the same way. But how much of a delta there is between those two, you know, I do think there is a common ground. And this is much more complicated on the front end as well, right? Like, I think this is a much simpler channel to sort of thread through on the server side. On the client side, it's a little bit more fraught and a bit more opinionated. But that's just my thoughts. It's like there's definitely, I think, you know, the people who are between the people who are involved, there's definitely enough sort of brain power to try and come up with a nice common denominator that satisfies the core stuff and doesn't just offload it to, oh, we're using that provider, none of that works, it's all no-op, blah blah blah, right? Like, I do think think there's quite a lot of work in front of that if we were to try and aim for that as a goal.
So I've had a look at the front end SDKs for a few providers, and my gut feel is they do act quite consistently, but they do act and they do work totally different to the backend ones. Really, it comes down to a client SDK, at least on the web, which is where I've mainly been looking, initializes in a way that's asynchronous, and then potentially has a secondary sort of asynchronous call saying the client's ready, i.e. the sort of flags have been hydrated. And from then on, flag evaluations are all happening synchronously and basically calling getters to basically looking at a map of features that have been retrieved all in one go, which is quite drastically different to the back end, where I guess you're fetching like one feature at a time and evaluating one Boolean or evaluating one string. But with front end sort of SDKs, it's way more sort of stateful, and you're basically getting the entire feature set more often than not. And from then on, in your functions and your components and your rendering, it's all basically synchronous getters to the flags and remote config values.
So how you store your state is a provider concern, whether it's a remote API call each time or you download it all up front.
I think that's true, except for the JavaScript thing, right? Because like the thing that the current spec does that makes it really hard, or the current SDK does that means that you basically can't. That makes it hard to look like the thing that Carl's describing is those evaluations are array sync, right? And you can't make, in most languages you can make it look sync because you can just have a blocking call, but you can't in JavaScript. Like, you just can't. So because the SDK doesn't have a sync API in JavaScript, it feels weird. That's like
That's-
one of the.
That's the thing where I'm a little bit confused. I mean, I'm happy to be corrected, but I don't see why. I mean, to me, the biggest thing missing from what Kyle's talking about is actually the ability to wait on some kind of a readiness event. We have a hacky way to do that right now, and it's not super relevant for backend providers. We also have the experimental node version that has some basic eventing. I believe honestly that basic eventing can be used to solve that problem. You could basically just await an on-ready and a provider, maybe not. I'm interested in hearing Pete's feedback. But the thing that I still don't quite understand is why it's important that evaluation is synchronous. I mean, whether or not you've pulled everything down and put it into a local hash, fantastic. Just do promise.resolve from whatever you retrieve from the hash. That's the thing that I'm a little bit confused about, why that matters, why we can't use an async API.
I can definitely sort of explain that with an example. I guess that could be the next step, but essentially, I feel like if it was async, it would kind of be unusable in that what you want to do is have like the app root it be async, and that's totally fine, and you can show a loader while that's happening. But in components, subcomponents, pages, and in function calls that are happening inside like renders and mounting, you kind of need them to be synchronous, because otherwise there would be sort of, you would have to handle pretty much fake immediate sort of loads, and you would have to show a loader whilst that async function is calling back. So for example, you fetch all of your flags, you initialize your flags at the app root, and then in your index page, or maybe a subcomponent of the index page, if it was asynchronous, you would have to do, I mean, like hooks aside, if you develop some like React hooks, you would have to do the equivalent of like use effects and set state to ready as true straight after that asynchronous call. And it's just not, that isn't very suitable. Like what's way easier to work with is like you're just doing like flag provider dot get boolean, and it's there immediately, so you don't have to show loaders or all of your subcomponents, like they render immediately, and there's no sort of like flickering, I guess, within all of your components. I don't know whether that makes sense, but I think kind of both of you are right in that, like, you can do it, right? Like it's not like an application author can't do it, but it's a pain, right? Like if you're using React, like I don't think, Todd, we can just say like, why can't you just, like, if you're a React developer, like you can use like use effect or a promise or whatever, like what's the, like, just learn to program, dude. Like I think it's got to be like there's definitely a reason why, to Kyle's point, there's a reason why like all of the APIs have done this. It's because if they didn't originally build it that way, they had a bunch of devs that were trying to use the thing and saying like why do I have to put, like, load the thing, like do an initial evaluation, wait for it to come back, and then store the state, and then manage all the state and blah blah blah. Why can't you just give me a bag of all the flags and or like a synchronous method that I could call?
Just to jump in for a second.
Sorry, go ahead.
Great discussion. We are using OpenFeature with Launch Darkly on the client side in the code base that I work on, and it does work, but it is also very clunky. So you can definitely do the hacky things, the use effects, the custom hooks to make it happen, React context, whatever that looks like. But it also feels unintuitive and more difficult than it should. So those are both true from my perspective, that it is possible, but it is also a little bit clunky.
So
I want to,
we need, you know, I think essentially what Kyle was talking about is the server-side SDKs don't have a concept of like multi-threadedness, and the front-end SDKs that we're talking about, you know, they want to grab the flags asynchronously off a separate thread that doesn't impact UI, and then, you know, asynchronously react to that response coming back, right? Like that's the paradigm that Android, Kotlin, and Swift, and even like React and React Native use, right? Like is that the sort of essence of the thing boiled down as a problem?
So I think it's slightly bigger. I'll be really brief, but I think it's slightly bigger. The thing that almost every client SDK makes an assumption about is that the context is basically representing a user. And I think if we want to make that decision, we can. We haven't done that yet. So all of our API assumes like, context is something you can pass in. And that's because we've mostly focused on the server. I think if we want to move in the direction we're talking about, we need to kind of agree that when we're talking about clients, we're kind of going to make the same assumption that you're working in the context of in the context of one context that's more static and then is updated. Yeah. Pete, sorry.
I think that's 100%. I think a lot of the assumption is that the reason front end APIs have these synchronous things is because it's like you can't block the UI or because it's easier. I actually think it's because they have the luxury of not having to do actual flag evaluations. You can go to the source of truth and say, for the current context, what flag should I show? And basically keep that static almost for like the length of the app. If you want to be fancy, you can stream in changes, so you can turn features on or off for like a long running session. With backend is the opposite, where you can happily block while you go to make a network call or whatever, but you can't like every single request, the context is different. So like that's why I think that like there's a way to solve both. I think like we just need to kind of like figure out how to build an API that works for both of those. The other thing that no one's talked about yet, but there's also, I think, the thing that all of the vendors have had to bolt in later on as they've tried to grow their business is analytics. And I bet if we talked to most of the vendors, I keep on meaning to do this, but I haven't, they would say that this whole thing of evaluating all the flags and just giving it to the JavaScript developer is a huge pain, because now they don't know which flags are being evaluated, and they don't have any analytics on, this flag was used, this flag wasn't used.
So that's very true. So the way that Flagsmith deals with that is, regardless of whether it's got that, there's still function calls to get that. It doesn't matter if it's synchronous. What's happening in the background is when you're saying get flag value, it's in the background rather than accessing that state directly. And I'd imagine that would be the case with all of them. Really, there's getters to sort of get the flag values, and the analytics would be happening in the background. And I don't think you would have to worry about that with the providers. I think that would be happening in the background, I'd assume.
I think that's kind of true. I think there's some implementations where, for historic reasons, they just have it as like a dictionary, and you have to call a method. I think Split does it that way, for example. But like, I think you're right that whenever we get around to doing the analytics piece, we should just. I think it's easy enough to support. You just need to never just give someone that raw bag and give them like a thing with some synchronous methods that they can call. But the thing is, that does still make it hard for, like, if you talk to a team at like a big company, that's like the ideal, I think, for most companies, like, oh, all of our teams are using LaunchDarkly or whatever, right? But if you're like Uber and you have like 1 million feature flags or whatever ridiculous number they have in their mobile app, you can't just say to each team, well, just go and get all of the flags and just tell us which flags you need. So like, you have to have some kind of like, then I mean, there's a little bit more complexity to just say like, oh, just get all of the flags and then just call the ones you need. You have to kind of have a little bit of awareness of which flags you need, blah, blah, blah. But like, I feel like it's a pretty solvable problem, as long as we just keep in mind that we can't just, we'd be painting ourselves into a corner if we ever just said, for some hypothetical synchronous API, why don't we just give everyone like a batch of all of the flags?
So that's not only true for retrieving the flags, but that's also true for event handling as well. So let's say you've got instances where like loads of flags can change, but you're on a page on the front end that's very expensive to render. You don't want the ideally, you don't want the re-renders to happen unless only the flags you care about change, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So yeah, like when thinking about event handling, one thing that would be nice is to be able to say, I want to listen to just when this one flag changes, so that you're not doing a load of re-renders. That's especially true in like React Native, like where it's quite sensitive to sort of performance. Yeah, so that's true not only just for what you just said, but yeah, events as well.
There is currently an OFAP open for events, and I think that's a great point. There's been a little bit of discussion in there and different ideas around it. So if anybody has input on that, I'd love to hear about it in the events OFAP, because I think I agree with everything you just said. It's kind of the same concern, Kyle. I think there's a couple things as corollaries that we need to realize if we just to put it out there, if we want to go down maybe having multiple APIs or additional APIs for the front end, it means that a lot of things, especially in JavaScript, have to change. Like hooks, if we want to implement them in the client, can no longer be async. They now have to be, or they have to. We need to think about that, because right now they're expecting to be able to return a promise. That probably won't work. We'll need to make them synchronous, or at least support some of them being synchronous, and understand the drawbacks of that. Like maybe there's some that you want to not await and just fire, asynchronously, but there's some that if they're mutating the context, you can no longer await them, right? So that becomes a little bit tricky. Same with the provider contracts.
Wait,
and the other point, go ahead, Pete.
No. Keep going. I'm interrupting people.
Well, that was one thought, so I'll let people address that.
I mean, I just want to put this out there as a model that I think is a good way of just thinking about this in general, is keep the core SDK purely asynchronous and do what I think it was Jake was saying.
I think.
Sorry?
I think Tom mentioned something about wrapping it, but I'm not sure if that's what you're thinking of. So
yeah, or
no,
like
I'm interrupting,
what
so
Jake was
sorry.
saying, like we're using the server side launch darkly thing on the client side, and we're having to do some stuff on top. I think we could do that stuff on top, like in a spec'd out like standard way that comes with the SDK, but it's all like basically build like a synchronous like API that does the prefetching and the caching and storing it like managing the state as a kind of essentially like sugar, like a second layer on top of like that core asynchronous SDK. Like keep the core asynchronous, like it just like purely async, and then build the stuff on top, which would basically be a way to at kind of like boot, go, or actually whenever the evaluation context changes in any way, go and refetch things, store them locally, and expose like a synchronous thing, and plus all of the gubbins that you have to say like, oh, I'm not ready yet. So like, all the extra stuff on top.
I do have, this actually has brought up a question. I do wonder whether the client SDKs of all of the providers would easily, the web ones and all the client side ones would easily support the current spec as well, or whether they would have to be, like I think Flagsmith front end one would have to be sort of altered quite a bit to support that core spec to fetch individual flags, because it's just not, it just wouldn't do, it doesn't really have a use case for doing that. That's like fine, like
I mean, no, we could support it.
We just do that.
I think the essence of the thing here is, do you want the provider to keep the state of the flags between get flag calls, right? That's literally it. Is it? I don't think there's anything more than that. Like, almost always, not always, but almost always, client SDKs grab all their flags, not if you're Uber, and store them for the duration of that session, and then they're just grabbing from memory. And we actually don't, I think we don't expose that map, right? Like with Flagsmith, it's like, get my flags, what's the value of this flag, what's the value of that flag? You don't get access to that map because you shouldn't have access to it, because we can then calculate evaluations and stuff. So maybe it's just a case of saying like, I'm a provider that maintains state and the API can deal with that. I don't know whether it would be around or the other way around, but that's effectively, I mean, that's the core difference between our front end and back end SDKs, really.
I don't think it, I think that it's not exactly that simple for all of the potential providers because of like the dynamic, like evaluating rules, right? Like evaluating rules may, like, basically if we allowed like a synchronous version of the API for JavaScript, we'd basically be saying like you have to do all of your rule evaluation statically, like at the very like basically you have to you can't use like a web worker or something like that to run the rules. You have to have like it all living on the client, and maybe maybe that would work for all the existing providers. I bet there's a provider out there that expects that it has to make a network call like at boot to go off to some server somewhere or some web worker or something that's not a synchronous JavaScript call and say, hey, in the current context, give me tell me what the flag should be.
Well, yeah, I mean, flag D works that way, for instance, but what you could do is evaluate those asynchronously all initially using a context that's assumed to be static at the beginning, and then emit on ready once you've evaluated all of those. And that kind of goes back to your point, Pete, where we could maybe take the current API and hide it behind a synchronous API in a way. And what the assumption on how that operates would be, I think, is that at startup, at boot, you get a context, you have a statically configured context that is going to be for some defined amount of time valid. You evaluate everything, taking into account rules that you want. That's going to be an asynchronous process, probably. It would be pulling down rules in some cases. And then you maintain that state somewhere and then just allow access to that state until such a point it becomes invalid, which we may need mechanisms for. And then you have to do it again. I think that could work. I'm not necessarily convinced that that's easier than just exposing a sync API. Personally, maybe, I don't know.
I mean, I think the big motivation for me is that is the goal of not requiring providers to essentially implement two distinct providers for the different. I
think they're going to have to be honest. Like the way flags are synced and everything, they just work differently. Like the dependencies and everything. Could be wrong in some cases, but like you're not going to burn in like certain things client side.
Yeah, I think the other way around as well, I think some providers would be using libraries that just wouldn't be able to work in Node, especially if like we're dealing, like I think some clients have like WebSockets and that sort of thing. Like I bet they're using
storage, local storage too. Yeah. I think there's too many things in that category to expect many providers, unless they have other abstraction layers themselves where they can plug those things in. I don't think. Yeah, I don't know. I don't expect that's going to happen.
That would break Flagsmith's thinking about it. You're absolutely right. Yeah, it wouldn't work.
I just wanted to say that one thing to think about if we're talking about providers holding state or a cache is with that comes the determination of when to invalidate and refresh. And that is also a very complex, tricky subject. So I'm in favor of leaving that up to the implementing developer rather than making an opinionated decision.
There is definitely a confusing thing as to when the asynchronous initializations should resolve around caching, around default flags, if you don't have network access. Like I've got a rough idea that does apply with Flagsmith, and I think it sounds like it would in most cases, but yeah, that's going to be quite complex. I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of the different providers act in totally different ways on like resolving around that.
Pete, I'm interested in, at some point I was mentioning maybe that we could leverage the proposed event APIs that were POC'd for kind of that initial asynchronous load. And I think you shook your head. So I don't know if we ever came back to that, but I'd like to get your take on that.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking of the evaluation context thing of just it's more than just because the current async the current API assumes that at any point you can pass it in a new evaluation context. I think that's like actually the fundamental hard thing is the difference between is this evaluation context going to change every time, or can like basically, yeah, that's the main difference in the paradigm. There's all this other difference around, you know, like what capabilities are available on different platform and like how expensive network calls are and stuff like that. But I really think like actually the core difference is, do we need to like support a different evaluation context, which might mean like actually like reevaluating the flags. I think all that
I
other stuff
agree.
So, to be honest,
I think there's a waterfall of different conclusions that come from whether or not how we go on that point. I agree with you. So I think that is important. I think we need to look at it in terms of that. Like, do we want to treat evaluation context differently in the client? Is I think the question, and there's a lot of data that's going to feed back into the answer, and then the answer we choose there is going to have consequences. You know, like Jake was talking about, with an explicit way to invalidate the context, or when like on a logout or something like that, or if some user attribute is changed. I think that you're right. Like that's the key piece.
All right.
But, yeah.
Sorry,
I still think it is worth. I've been thinking about this for months because I know it's going to be really hard to do, but like I still think we should try to not. I think we should really try and hold the line on not having to have different providers for front end and back end, because I still believe. I think that there's like. I think that like if you look at like all of the vendors, the end of the day, they all go back to the same. It's not like there's two completely different stacks for front end and back end. They're just like essentially different adapters in front of like the same machinery. I think that all of the stuff that the vendors are doing to make like, you know, Flagsmith work in Node and JavaScript, for example, that rather than having every vendor figure that out and do it in inconsistent and everyone is buggy ways, I think we can take that part on and do that inside of this like layer inside of the SDK, and allow the providers to just give some like core kind of like fundamental kind of like functionality that we need, like the adapters, and solve that problem. I mean, maybe I'm kind of just super naive about it, but
I think that could be true, but it's not true for Flagsmith, and like definitely with cases where you've got real-time flags, I don't think it's going to be the case for them either. I think
like at some point for the front end and back end code, you are okay.
Sorry to interrupt, but yeah, I think we should probably I think that probably the next step, maybe Todd, if you could summarize this and maybe, you know, FEP or something like that.
Separate meeting,
yeah, and a separate meeting. This is a huge topic that is going to require a lot of debate.
I just think there's a little bit of confusion, because I want to make sure that I'm not confused. Pete, you said you hope that we can have the same provider across front end and back end. Do you mean SDK or provider? I just want to make sure I understood you correctly.
I mean
provider.
So like literally,
so
there's like there's a single JavaScript provider for Launch Darkly, and it would work and it would work in both contexts.
Okay. Yeah.
So Todd, if you can kind of take that as like a follow-up, then get us started. And then there's obviously a lot of interest in this. So like make sure to put it in the channel and try to get it there. And we can, you know, schedule a dedicated meeting to this one if we need to, or definitely follow up on the next one. But yeah, probably need to move on to a few other topics quickly. So perfect. All right. But I guess you get to keep talking, Todd, because you are next. So
yeah, I'm next. So, I mean, I don't think this is going to take too long. I have a board that is currently hidden in GitHub which I did a quick review on with a couple people, but I think I'm going to make it public really soon. And all it does is kind of what you see right there, establishes a security baseline for repositories. So kudos to mostly Justin, to be honest, because I think that basically everything we have here is already implemented in the Java SDK. There's a few, I think the only exception is SAST scanning, which especially in the case of Java, I'm not sure is extremely valuable because we have things like find bugs or spot bugs or, you know, whatever it is now, and check style, etc. There's free options for SAS scanning, so I might give it a shot. But I think just about everything else here is implemented in the Java SDK. I think as we go, we have 1.0s of 3 other SDKs, and I think we need to kind of bring them up to that level. And there's a varying level of compliance across all these different things. So I'd like to document these, and I'm going to be taking some time myself to implement them in a lot of repositories. I don't think it's that hard. It's also not always possible. Like artifact signing is not a thing in JavaScript right now. Somebody can feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. There's alpha support and SigStore for it, but I don't want to adopt an alpha thing. I digress. But anyway, so there's that. I'm going to make it public. I'd like to do this. If anybody has a huge problem with this proposal, let me know. But yeah, we can have discussion when I convert it to an issue. I'll put a comment in the channel about it. Any comments right now?
I'd love to be a resource on any of this supply chain stuff. So reach out to me.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Well, I think you were going to be anyway, but but thanks for volunteering formally.
It's my decision if I offer.
There you go.
Yeah, just kidding. Anyway, so then there's also a security policy. So I'd like to have, like, we have a security policy at this at the URL link there. It doesn't have to be crazy. There may not even be anything we want to add to it. But if anybody has any thoughts, you can look at other projects. It could involve things like disclosure information and who to reach out to if there's a vulnerability found or something like that. If you guys have any thoughts, I'd just like to review it. That there's nothing formal here. I just, yeah, if there's anything anybody thinks we're missing that really needs to be added there, I'd like to do it. So I don't know if there's thoughts on that.
Private disclosure. We need some sort of place to do private disclosure.
That's kind of what I'm thinking too. I think. I don't know if anybody has like specific tangible recommendations for that. But yeah.
A separate email
agree,
list from scripts.io.
Yeah, I think that's
Probably
what we'll
good
probably
idea.
end up doing. Okay. So Justin, can you just bring that up in the governance meeting then and make sure we get that addressed then? Thanks. Cool. Next one. This one's kind of a cool update, and it's probably the longest well, PR that I've ever been a part of, to be honest. It was almost like 9-10 months worth of back and forth for probably like 5 lines of code changed. But basically it was adding semantic convention to the OTel spec for feature flagging. This applies to events on a span and logs. So they're basically like the same convention can be worked on either piece. The kind of interesting part from that second part about the logs, it does mean that if a vendor wanted to just add in like kind of lightweight support for this, you could just basically have support for a log message that follows this convention as well. You wouldn't have to pull in libraries or anything. Having said that, OpenFeature has a couple issues open for the 1.0 SDKs right now to basically add a hook for that. It should be incredibly simple. Like it can be done in a few lines of code, and it would basically just add, if a span is available, it's just going to add this basically event onto it in a certain format. So those are all open and available. If there's any interest in getting involved, feel free to comment on one of those issues and we can assign it to you. And then, but otherwise we'll just kind of keep ticking them off the list as we have time. So like I said, it shouldn't take too long, but I'd like to get it done now that we push to get it in the OTel spec. We might as well use it. So yeah, pretty cool. Next one, we did start creating some like getting started docs. There's just a couple right now. There's one for Java and one for JavaScript. There is some feedback from Pete that I still need to take care of, where we want to have JavaScript and TypeScript, so you can kind of toggle between it. Haven't done that one yet, but I'm going to go ahead and knock that out. And also have some kind of like follow-ups, like next steps. So those things haven't been done yet, but they're on my to-do list. But there are open items for other SDKs. So if someone wanted to take a crack at Go or any of the other getting started guides, there should be issues already created for that. So if you have any interest in contributing, feel free to take a look and assign it to yourself and go ahead and knock it out.
There's common building blocks too, if you're interested in doing that. If you look at the TypeScript and the JavaScript one, there's like blurbs of text, etc., which you can literally just render if you want to keep the same scaffolding.
Yep, exactly. And then if you have feedback too, let me know too, so we can make sure to make the docs as clear as possible. They're incredibly simple right now. It doesn't do anything complex, and maybe we do layer in complexity at some point. But for now, it's basically just like the hello world example of feature flagging essentially. And then the last one, I did kind of tease this. The last one, I'm not probably going to give a demo. I didn't really get a chance to dive into it too much further. I think the next step may be just like an OFAP, basically to kind of describe the goals here and get some feedback. But at a really, really high level, and Justin kind of was the inspiration for this originally, but if we're able to define the feature flags somewhere in your code and then pass that into the SDKs, you can basically leverage, well, the compiler for one, but also like, some like IntelliSense type stuff in your IDEs to like autocomplete valid flag keys. I have a proof of concept in TypeScript, which is pretty cool. Like it's aware of like the default response type, so it only shows up in the appropriate methods, things like that. I really like it, but it requires, a little bit of, work, and I'm not sure how it would apply, broadly across other languages, or if it even needs to. I also don't think it necessarily requires a spec change to do, because it's just like another way of passing in, a flag key and default value. So I'll try to create like at least an initial issue there, so people can kind of look through it and provide feedback early. But I'd like to get thoughts there, because I think it could be a very powerful, way to kind of centralize feature flags in your code and make it a little bit more user friendly. That's basically it for me. And then
I think that would be like, I guess, like you said, it's still early days, but like I guess something to put in your brain is like whether it would be something that would be something on top of like the core kind of spec or SDK, where we're kind of giving people like, like if there was a React specific API or like a TypeScript API where it would kind of give people mechanisms to do that, or do you think it would actually be something that would get baked into the way that the spec works?
I don't like, and that's something we can talk about. I don't think it would require any kind of spec change necessarily. It could just be in the SDKs, and we could basically provide the mechanism to say, like, if you know your flags ahead of time, you throw it in this. Actually, I'll just share my screen real quick. Keep in mind, this is incredibly rough, but basically the idea is you could do something sort of like this, where you'd have some kind of like flag configuration. I had to put it behind this method here for TypeScript to basically do the type enforcement piece. But that would allow you, because this is the key and the default value. And then basically, depending on like the method here, and I'd have to look at why this is not fully working. I must have a typo or something. I wasn't fully prepared to show. Oh, this is the reason. Basically here you can see that now the system, we're creating a client that's like feature flag aware. Now it's like literally in here, it will like autocomplete. You see that 6 isn't in there because it's a string value and we're looking for Booleans and stuff like that. So that was kind of the idea. Now I get rid of this up here, and all of a sudden, the compiler starts complaining that we're removing it. And you also see that we don't have to pass in a default value because it's centralized somewhere in your code. So
yeah, and this, I believe, Justin and I, like at a really high level, talked about how we might do this in Java, and I believe very similar things are possible. And it really just involves some additional type arguments, so the compiler can help you with some of this stuff. But I kind of agree with Mike that I don't think it needs to be spec'd. It's just a nice feature we can add into SDKs, in my opinion.
If there was some magical way that we could have the type safety extend to like generics for the method, so that you don't have to say Boolean value, string value, that has been driving me crazy in like playing with the SDK. But I also get that it's pretty hard to do.
I mean, in TypeScript, we can almost certainly do it. In other languages, it'd be tricky, but maybe TypeScript's the important one because then it's client side and then it's, so I don't know.
If you lost, I think you can do it, but only if you have the default value is kind of like a nice thing.
Right, but that would
anyway,
be part of
that's like
this
a whole-
configuration, but yeah, it's something we can certainly think about.
Yeah.
Okay, that was it for my topics. It looks like Justin, you got a couple others and we have about 10 minutes left, so.
Cool. Mine are pretty fast. One, I'm officially nudging that we should just cancel the next meeting. It's going to be heading into the holidays. We're getting to the time of year where nothing gets done. And maybe we can use that as a special session where we talk about this front end thing. And that's the whole meeting.
That can make sense. Yeah, okay.
Second, I would love it if we had a website thing where OFEPs were listed. So I can like link to them and it's not just a in progress pull request or not a here is a diff on a diff on a diff sort of deal.
Mm-hmm. How would you, I mean, how would you see that working? Would it be like a submodule again in our docs where you could just go there directly once they're merged, or something more like, or maybe specific, like maybe a GitHub action to deploy specifically for OFEPs or something, and just keep it in that repo? Like, what would be the preference there? Or no preference, you just want it available online somewhere?
Yeah, that. I basically want this. Like this is the Python one of like each one and what it does roughly. And
I mean, I feel like with the current doc mechanisms, we could maybe do this just as an external module. Mike, updating it, I'm not sure about that, but
can you include that in the docs though, Justin? I think that is it, because I've at least at the very least the structure of the OFEPs are kind of painful, you know, because I think we can, yeah, look at how other tools are doing it successfully and see what we can do there, and then maybe once they're merged, if we have the table structure easy to publish somewhere, you know, it could either live in the official docs or in just the repo that we could link to. So I think that makes sense, especially because I think we'll want to be adding quite a few of these, and having some kind of structure, I think makes a lot of sense. Yeah. Anyone else have any thoughts on that? I think it makes sense. It's just priority, and if someone has a chance to kind of work on it, or the specific details, you know, that we're looking for, and maybe just an issue, you know, Justin, if you want to create one or something, we can share it and kind of chat through that there. But yeah, I'm up for it. It makes sense. I think even the structure of that repo would be even that would be a big benefit to us, because right now it's just throwing it like the root, and it makes it hard to kind of follow along. Okay. Yeah, anyone else have anything? Cool. I think it probably does make sense, based on Justin's recommendation. We'll probably just cancel like the regular meeting next time, and if we want to use that for something client side specific, we could. If we want to do a client side some other time, I do think that's a big focus over the next, you know, little bit though. Figuring out the client side pieces is obviously a massive part of feature flagging, and it's something that we hadn't really, you know, addressed up at this point, and clearly there's interest. So I think that's going to be kind of the next big priority for us.
maybe what I can do is set up
I'll try to represent people.
Sorry, go. Sorry, I said talk at the same time, Justin. What did you say?
I said I can try to represent the eBay mobile people.
Perfect.
Great.
Thanks.
Yeah, that'd be appreciated. I was thinking maybe I'll set up a poll in the channel, and we can just assume the same time. I don't know. If we just did the same time, would it be good for everybody here? Maybe it's not necessary to do a poll to talk about client stuff, or should we move it around because it's going to be on the 22nd?
I think it's a good way to go into Christmas, honestly. It makes everyone feel, you know, good around the holidays to know more about client-side feature flagging. So yeah, message us if you want to change the date. Otherwise, we'll just plan on that. And then I think just the prep work would be the issue that Todd will create. So like, let's take advantage of that. So we go into that meeting with a lot of, you know, specific questions we want answered, and hopefully have some like tangible output from that meeting.
Yeah, I'll try and represent. I might review this video, but I'll try and represent as much of what we discussed about an issue, and then we can have some conversation there. Yeah.
Perfect.
I
Sounds
tried
good.
to take notes, but I was also talking a lot, so I didn't do a great job taking notes. And
That's
also,
all right.
sorry
We have it recorded too, so we can review it if we need to. Perfect. All right. Thanks, everyone. Appreciate the feedback.
Thanks, guys. Have a good holiday. Don't see you guys.
Yeah, you too. We'll talk to you later.
Hello.
Yes, thanks.
Bye.